Welcome to another series of lectures on contemporary issues of political theory. Today we will be discussing about decline of political theory, and of course in the later part we will also be discussing the resurgence of political theory. So before we begin, let me give you the gist of what my lecture today would be. First of all, I will be trying to explain to you what is that decline and what are the factors of the decline of political theory as propagated by different scholars. And after that, we will be certainly discussing about the contemporary conditions as well as the resurgence of political theory, and then the debate on the death of political theory. Let me also give you a gist that there are various factors which I will discuss in this particular lectures as responsible to the argument for the decline of political theory. First is the eclipse of liberalism, then historicism and the decline of political theory, then hyperfactualism, then of course pursuit of fact about life, and the dominance of moral theory. So these are the factors that led to various scholars to argue that political theory was on the decline, especially before the Second World War. So now, let us begin by taking you all to a period before the Second World War. So before the Second World War, we all know that political theory has got stagnated, especially after Karl Marx, because there was absolutely no renowned thinkers and scholars who would provide new innovative ideas about political concepts, political principles, and so on and so forth. However, after the Second World War, there was a major effort that was made to base political theory upon the foundation of empirical research and also to scrutinize political principles based on facts and data. So, in the earlier period, we have all come to know that political theory had no separate existence, but rather it was part of political science. And the problem with political science was then, therefore, that it was, it had to cohabit with history, economics, and sociology. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that before all this, political science as a subject was highly dependent on history, economics, sociology, and therefore it could not exist on its own. It could not derive its own principles, its own concept, and its own theories. So, therefore, serious research and investigation about emerging political narrative, emerging political conditions was being halted, or there was practically no place in political science. It is in this context that we have a renowned scholar on this issue of decline of political theory named as David Easton, who wrote, I quote, he said, I quote, political theory today is interested primarily in the history of ideas, which means that political theory then, by that point of time, was only interested in reformulating the existing ideas that had already existed in the history of the discipline. So he says this was the exact character of political theory. And as such, therefore, political theory had to suffice itself with the notions and values and general principles that were provided to it by scholars in history, or by the development of ideas in the past. So therefore, for David Easton, he said, this cannot be the position of political theory. So therefore, for him, he argued that values and principles and history cannot be the sole determiners of political theory. So, political theory cannot simply depend on the existing values, principles, and history. So, therefore, the problem arising from this fact that political theory was stagnated by ideas that had existed then, resulted in the fact that the classical and the modern political scientists thereafter did not rather pay much attention to the development of theoretical analysis with the help of data. So instead of developing analysis and data and facts in order to contextualize any concept, in order to contextualize any new ideas, what has happened then is we depended on the existing principles that was provided to us throughout in the past history. So therefore, David Easton and many others made it their responsibility to actually rewrite the whole meaning of political theory, and also to treat it as part of empirical science, and therefore to reject other things that has kept political theory at the backdrop. So therefore, the emerging trend or the emerging tendency to identify the term both as metaphysical speculations or abstractions, and the desire to remove the empirical observation and control and the history of political thought was the tendency of the emerging research on what is political theory. So therefore, to identify data and concept to this metaphysical speculations and the history of political thought was the attempt of people like David Easton. And in this particular way, various factors of the debate of the decline of political theory was being developed by these scholars in order to be able to make an argument as to whether there is really the decline of political theory, and if there are factors responsible for the decline of political theory, then certainly those factors will be categorized by these scholars. So, in this particular way, various factors, as I said, and among the various factors, the first one that scholars have argued is the eclipse of liberalism. What is this eclipse of liberalism? So, as I said in the beginning, that the study of political science was then based on history, or it was supported by historical data, and it therefore got exposed, and therefore in this way it exposes the fact that from the 1990s liberal thought and liberalism was pursuing through a number of crises. So what I'm trying to say is that we have already seen the rise of liberalism, the emergence of liberal ideas, and so on and so forth. But after 1920s, liberal thought and liberalism was also facing a crisis. And what is the crisis? The establishment of the Bolshevik rule in Russia laid the foundation of collectivism and the curtailment of individual freedom initiative, which means that till that moment, what happened is, especially enlightenment and many other things that happened in the past, has given way to liberal ideas, to theories of liberalism, to individual liberty. People like J.S. Mill and others have talked about all this. But after some time, especially with the influence of Marxism, Bolshevik rule was established in Russia. And therefore, this led to the curtailment of individual liberty, individual freedom narrative. So, in other words, what happened is after the First World War, there was a belief that gathered momentum, and that was that the only state-sponsored projects, with enormous authority, with enormous possibility, can be, the way forward for the removal of numerous mysteries which common people were actually facing. So basically what this alternative ideology, or what this alternative alternative governance or regime was trying to project was that in the past we have argued that individual liberty, individual rights, individual freedom, these were important. But with the emergence of Marxism, socialism, and especially the rise or the establishment of Bolshevik rule in Russia, that now it is the responsibility of the state, and the state with its enormous or gargantuan projects can actually remove the miseries of people and the problem that people were facing till that point of time. So, therefore, in this way, as I said, the eclipse of liberalism came about, and this drastically corroded individuals' freedom and individuals' liberty. Again, in 1930s, American capitalism also experienced an unprecedented crisis, and the White House actually adopted certain measures which went against liberalism. So David Easton, he diagnosed another reason for the eclipse of liberalism. In his opinion, he says that the problem of contemporary liberalism was its general failure to put theories to the test of social reality. So what is happening is, what is David Easton trying to say is that, political theory or political science as a discipline has failed to actually contextualize the existing social reality. And therefore, the theories that existed in the past, have become the problem. So, therefore, in his opinion, this is the contemporary liberalism, or this is the problem of theories, and therefore, contemporary liberalism was its general failure, which put actually the role of political theory at a test. So therefore, from then onwards, he argued that scientific method should be used to discover social facts about the source of political power. So therefore, as I said from the very beginning, liberalism as well as political theory must have to be based on rigorous empirical study in order to remain relevant. This is the argument of David Easton. So if this technique, he says, is strictly followed, the fragility of liberalism or the question of the decline of political theory can be contained or can be stopped. So therefore, to him, the concept of the idea of the decline of political theory, he says, exists in the political system. Okay, it exists in the political system, and therefore, since it exists in the political system, unless political theory analyze the role of the existing political system and the political behavior within the political system, then the role of political theory may certainly be under question. Now, the second important factor, according to David Easton, is the the role of historicism. The role of historicism, or in his own words, in the words of David Easton, he says political theory has been devoted to a form of historical researches that has robbed it of its earlier constructive role. So what is historicism? So in this particular context, if we talk of historicism, then historicism actually means that it means a certain system of belief that tries to argue that history is governed by an inexorable or an unstoppable laws of change, and that human action are guided by permanent ultimate purposes. So therefore, in this particular context, if David Easton argued that if political theory is dependent too much on the role of history, then certainly political theory would remain, to be dominated by history, and therefore it will lead to its insignificance or it will lead to its decline. So, what David Easton is trying to say is that if political theory is dependent too much on principles and on data that have been provided by history, then it will certainly cease to be relevant. So David Easton, he cited the example of Dunning's work, where Dunning believed that political theory was nothing but a historical account, of condition and the consequences of political ideas. So what David Easton is saying is that traditionally political science and political scientists in general have built up their principles of political science on the basis of historical facts, which they have collected from history, from the past history, and therefore this approach made political theory completely dependent on history, and as such, therefore, it lost its identity, it lost its relevance. So, apart from Dunning, there are of course other scientists as well who were a proponent of these concepts. For example, we have George Sabine, who wrote a famous book, History of Political Theory. And therefore, he explained in this particular text, he tried to explain the deep and inseparable relationship between history and political theory. And he said, Sabine said that political theory is the product of politics. And therefore, history contains incidents of politics. So, therefore, this is the kind of text that existed at some point of time, which try to argue that political science cannot be taken away from the discipline of history, the discipline of economics and sociology. So David Easton believed that if such excessive dependence of political theory on history, on historical facts and historical data, then definitely there will be no difference between history and political science. And if that is the case, then political science will lose its importance. So therefore, what people like David Easton are trying to argue is that political theory, if it has to revive itself, if it has to emerge as an important discipline, then it has to, of course it will be dependent on many other disciplines, but it has to certainly come out of the dominance of these other factors. Another very important aspect of the decline of political theory, or the arguments for the decline of political theory, is what is called as hyperfactualism. So, what is hyperfactualism? David Easton believed that an excessive dependence upon facts and the failure to relate these facts to theory is hyperfactualism. So, therefore, that he said, there is a saying, or he himself said, that from the beginning of the 20th century, there have occurred a lot of research in the field of political science, but the contribution of these research to the development of political theory is not worthy at all. That is because, according to Easton, these research were generally characterized by hyperfactualism, and therefore the failure to marry facts with empiricism, the failure to marry facts or empirical research or empiricism to theory has therefore led to the decline of political theory, or rather you can say that the conceptualization of political theory has not taken place, and therefore certainly this will lead to its decline. So David Easton, he also criticized the approach of many political scientists who actually try to collect data with a lot of enthusiasm, and and then begin to generalize them singularly. So this generalization to David Easton, he says these are the narrow way of developing any particular concept. So this narrow perspective, he says, was interpreted as science, but he says this cannot be science, and this must not certainly constitute the basis of any viable political theory. So, in his opinion, Easton, he argued, and I quote, he says, most factual research is concerned with singular generalization, and therefore they are not broader type of theory. So, therefore, such research, he says, is what we call pursuit of the facts about political life. Okay, this is the pursuit of facts about political life. It is not about developing a concept, but rather it is just about, narrating the facts in the political history. So, therefore, this excessive dependence on facts and the apathy to explain in proper context, again, according to David Easton, is the indication that there is a lacuna, or there is an absence of the development of political theory. So, another important aspect or another important factor that can be argued as as responsible to the decline of political theory is what we can say as the role of moral theory, and how moral theory actually has for a very long time contained the development of critical ideas. So therefore, as I said, for several centuries, political science in general and also political theory in particular was dominated by the moral premises, especially coming from the Western civilization. So the most of the time, the exponents of these moral premises, they constantly and vigorously pitch their point that they are right, and that no objection or criticism can be leveled against them, as if the moral principle provided to them are eternal. So, because of this, he says, researchers then got disinterested, in launching any protracted or any lengthy research about the validity and the acceptability of mere moral values and concepts. So, therefore, in this particular way, what happened is political theory could not evolve on its own, because it was, it was being influenced, it was being curtailed by this problem, and that is the problem of the dominance of moral theory. So, and therefore, in this way, political science as a discipline itself suffered. It got crippled, and students of political theory then took no more interest to verify the various aspects of political theory with the help of new facts and data. So it was, therefore, it was difficult for them to challenge the prevailing notion of political theory at that point of time. So therefore, because of all these, the consequence of political theory, remained shrouded with vague notions and premises. And David Easton, he concluded by making another very important argument. And I quote, "The tendency towards moral conformity is both symptom of and a cause contributing to the lack of constructive approach. Therefore, it prevents the very kind of inquiry necessary for a thorough understanding of the values underlying research." Therefore, what David Easton is trying to tell us is that our tendency, or the tendency of the discipline itself, or the political science scholars, towards conforming to that moral theory or to ethical theory, is a symptoms and a cause which contributed to the lack of the development of the political theory approach, and therefore it prevents any kind of inquiry necessary to understand various other things. So in Easton's account, you can say that the influence of moral theory was so pervasive and powerful that political theory in the past could not get any scope to establish its own identity. So therefore, this has led to the decline of political theory as such. Now, the next important issue is ideological reductionism. We have already discussed what is ideology, and we already know that ideology is nothing but a coherent idea provided for an organized political action, and therefore it is a coherent ideas, and it is related to politics. Now, what is reductionism? Reductionism is actually the practice of simplifying these ideological principle, ideological idea, these ideas uh, uh, in a way that is easy to explain. So basically, what it means is that the practice of analyzing and describing any complex phenomenon and simplifying those fundamentals in order to be able to provide sufficient explanation is what the reductionism, or what we call as reductionism. So therefore, ideological reductionism means explaining discoherent ideas, practices to the people is the ideological reductionism. And according to Dante Germino, who wrote a book known as Beyond Ideology, The Revival of Political Theory, he says one of the major causes of the decline of political theory is, of course, the colorful emergence of ideology or ideological reductionism. Making ideological principles as to look as fancy, to look as though they are easily achievable, and so on and so forth, is, he says, the problem which has caused the decline of political theory. That is because, political theory, in the discipline of political theory, the complex issues have to be interrelated, and these complex issues, when they are interrelated, to provide certain certain methods of explaining and the society, explaining the behavior of people in the society, and also to provide ideas, innovation for dealing with those complexities, may make political theory look tough and difficult. But with the emergence of this ideology and ideological reductionism, people lost interest in the whole question of political theory. So therefore, there are a number of pioneers in the field of this ideological reductionism, and one of them is certainly Karl Marx, who studied several hundred years of political history, and after that arriving at certain conclusions which form Marxism. So for Dante Germino, and of course David Easton himself, even if Marxism form a part of political science, it cannot be constituted as an important segment of political theory. So therefore, simply said, political ideology and ideological reductionism and also the propagandist approach of ideology makes things rather difficult for the discipline of political theory. And Marx's political concept preached and propagated for a particular purpose, especially the purpose of emancipation of the working class through the abolition of capitalism by means of class revolution, class struggle, and so on and so forth. In many ways makes it appear as though it's achievable, and therefore when it is achievable means ideology is seen to be more relevant than political theory. So because of all this, political theory could not get its own scope to develop, and since it did not get a scope to develop, it was therefore contained, and this can be argued as the reason for the decline of political theory. So the contemporary conditions of various parts of the globe, have contributed to that decline of political theory. And some of these conditions can be stated. One such condition is, as I said, the emergence of communism or collectivism in several parts of Europe. And in the communist countries, we all know that party, bureaucracy, ideology completely dominated the political as well as the ideological affairs of the state. And in such a way, even academics world could hardly get an opportunity to think beyond that, to express freely. Therefore, political scientists and researchers and academicians were not in a position to pursue academic work without any outside restrictions. So therefore, we have also seen that in communist countries there is a major imposition of thought and feeling upon the intellectuals, and in this way, therefore, it certainly destroyed even the openness of the society, and the entire society lived with the unbearable suffocation, and therefore this also can be considered as the cause of the decline of political theory. Any critical thinking, any analysis of facts and data, was being constrained by the existing regime then. So even the so-called liberal or democratic societies and countries, people in these places were so obsessed with the idea that democracy was a kind of talisman, or a kind of good luck, that it can serve all sorts of purposes, and therefore in this way even the emergence of liberal democratic ideas led to complacency by various scholars, and therefore this also contributed to the decline of political theory. So so this whole situation again of believing that democracy is the answer to everything was also not congenial for the flourish and of free thinking, and of course this led to the decline of political theory. And at the same time, most of the big powers were engaged in enhancing their image and capability in international society, and the entire superstructure was surcharged with their own ideology. So free development of political theory was also affected by all these factors. Apart from all these, there was an absence of vision or men of vision. In the past, we have seen people like Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Hegel, Marx. They all, traverse the outer and the inner road of the political science and political theory, in providing philosophy, providing ideas. But after some time, this tradition of creating new visionary in the discipline was halted, and political science and scientists and theoreticians and philosophers were lacking the charisma to actually be able to fill the void in the society, especially in the arena of political theory, except for Karl Marx, who provided new visions of trying to explain that there need to be the emancipation of the working class. After that, there was absence of such men of vision. So therefore, all these things led to the decline of political theory. So let me end here, and I will continue again immediately by discussing the resurgence of political theory. Thank you.